Dear Patriots, before the news starts, please subscribe to our patriotic channel by clicking the subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up to this video. Don't forget to leave your opinion below in the comments section. Share the news on Facebook and Twitter so your friends see it. Thank you.
France tells Trump a trade war won't go his way. France has a message for Donald Trump: America's aggressive, go it alone tariff tactics are doomed. Speaking to Politico, French Trade Secretary Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne warned that the U.S. president risks igniting a trade war by imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, but insisted that his strategy would backfire. "We are entering an era where trade war is starting to show its teeth. And we think that's not good news," Lemoyne said in an interview in a Brussels hotel. American politics today, unilaterally putting in place a regime of additional tariffs on steel and aluminum, comes on the heels of a policy which aims to gut the dispute settlement system of the World Trade Organization. The U.S. president is using the threat of tariffs to pressure trading partners into new trade arrangements with Washington that he hopes will help slash America's yawning deficit. Mexico and Canada, for example, have only escaped duties on the condition that they strike a new version of the North American Free Trade Agreement that will tilt the balance of trade more in America's favor. Lemoyne retorted, however, that there was no way that the EU, the world's largest trade group, would be strong-armed into any sort of new transatlantic trade deal along those lines. In part, he explained, it was impossible to resurrect the idea of a transatlantic trade deal because Trump had quit the Paris Agreement on climate change. That has become a red line for new EU trade deals, at France's insistence. "We have said that to strike trade agreements, this must be done with countries whose governments are party to the Paris Agreement," he said. "Potentially blocking us on steel and aluminum to force a free trade deal is not the right way." Trouble on the home front. Lemoyne also stressed that Trump's tariffs would come back to bite the American economy. Beyond tariffs of 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, the president is proposing a broader policy of reciprocity. That would mean lifting tariffs on, say, European cars because the EU imposes higher duties on motor vehicles than the US does. While Lemoyne said Europe stood ready to retaliate directly against targeted US products, he argued that Trump would be deterred from a broader trade war when an arms race over tariffs ramped up prices for American consumers. "This escalation in taxes and tariffs isn't good for the American consumer," said Lemoyne. He added that recent U.S. tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber exports meant that American importers continue to import the Canadian wood but passed on the higher price to consumers. "In reality, this type of measure can turn against the Americans themselves," he said. Lemoyne also insisted that Trump would fail in his attempt to disable the World Trade Organization as the global forum to resolve trade disputes. The U.S. is vetoing the appointment of new judges in the WTO's appellate court, in what the French minister and the European Commission say is an attempt to undermine the institution. Lemoyne warned that France would push for the appellate court to continue its work despite Trump's opposition. "It is necessary to think about all the forms of Plan B, which make it possible to maintain a mechanism for those states that are in favor of having it. Because there is still a very strong majority of WTO countries that wish to continue to have this type of dispute settlement. So I think that now we must actually start to be creative, and therefore France will also put proposals on the table to restore efficiency to the WTO, both in its function as a developer of standards and in its function as a judge." French President Emmanuel Macron will discuss the trade tensions with Trump on his state visit to Washington next month, Lemoyne said. In another sign that Europe is unwilling to roll over in the face of Trump's threats, Lemoyne said that Paris would use the EU Leaders Summit on March 22 to 23 to establish what we call a European chief enforcer, who would be charged with the power to activate all sorts of control mechanisms and retaliation measures. Such an enforcer, who would work in the European Commission's Trade Department, could also be a deterrent vis-à-vis certain partners who sometimes test the limits. Sessions criticizes federal judges for slowing Trump's national agenda. Attorney General Jeff Sessions on Saturday railed against federal judges for impeding President Donald Trump's national agenda, telling students at a conservative gathering that a handful of judges are making themselves super legislators by authoring sweeping decisions in the heat of legal fights. In truth, this is a question of raw power, of who gets to decide the policy questions facing America, our elected representatives, our elected president or unelected lifetime appointed federal judges, Sessions told the Federalist Society's 2018 National Student Symposium at the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington. On topics like Trump's proposed travel ban and the ending of an Obama-era immigration program, Sessions complained that a single federal judge is able to issue a nationwide ruling that stops the administration in its tracks. Known as a nationwide injunction, such a ruling applies beyond the particular people involved in a case and remains in force even when another federal court sides with the administration. Such a split occurred this past week when a federal judge in Maryland upheld Trump's decision to end deferred action for childhood arrivals, but because of an earlier injunction from federal judges in California and New York, parts of the program remain in place. Trump is not the first president to face such legal hurdles, which Sessions said is not a partisan issue since it affected former President Barack Obama, too. A former conservative stalwart in the Senate, the Attorney General acknowledged that some Republicans sought similar legal battles on friendly turf, in states like Texas, during Obama's time in office, in a process known as forum shopping. But with Trump now in the White House, it is liberals who are hoping for advantages in places like California and Hawaii. The Obama administration failed to convince the Louisiana-based Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to strike down an injunction against DACA with a similar argument. The Supreme Court has not weighed indefinitely on the topic of nationwide injunctions, instead justices have ruled on the particulars of a specific case. But Sessions is optimistic that the highest court in the land will soon issue a brushback to would-be legal resistors. A federal appeals court can overturn or limit the scope of an injunction. We are hopeful that the Supreme Court will soon send a clear message to the lower courts that injunctions ought to be limited to the parties of the case, he said. Trump to make first visit to Latin America as president for summit. The White House announced on Saturday that President Donald Trump will travel to Peru next month to meet with the nation's president and participate in a summit with the region's leaders. The trip to the Summit of the Americas in Lima will be Trump's first visit to Latin America as president. There, Trump will meet with Peruvian President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski before traveling to Colombia to meet with its president, Juan Manuel Santos. The White House said Trump's discussions will focus on fair and reciprocal trade, and secure borders. This travel demonstrates the president's resolve to deepen our historical ties with our partners in the region and to strengthen our joint commitment to improve security and prosperity for the people of the Americas, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said in a statement. Trump has previously visited the Middle East, Asia and some of America's European allies. He is scheduled to host French President Emmanuel Macron late next month at the White House for the first state visit of the Trump presidency. On Saturday morning, Trump extended his thoughts to 3 women who were killed during a standoff at a veterans' home in California on Friday. According to media reports, a standoff at the veterans' home of California in Yountville left 3 women dead. The suspect was also found dead at the scene. We are deeply saddened by the tragic situation in Yountville and mourn the loss of 3 incredible women who cared for our veterans, the president wrote on Twitter. Trump's military parade, minus the tanks, set for Veterans Day. President Donald Trump will get his much-anticipated military parade, but it will not include some of the biggest military hardware, according to a planning memo released late Friday by the Pentagon. The event, which will take place November 11, will include troops from different branches, highlight the growing role of women in the armed forces and have a heavy air component of modern and historic warplanes, the memo says. Also participating will be veterans groups in the ceremonial Old Guard fife and drum corps. But it will not feature tanks rolling between the White House and Capitol to minimize damage to local infrastructure, the memo says. This parade will focus on the contributions of our veterans throughout the history of the U.S. military, starting from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 to today, with an emphasis on the price of freedom, adds the guidance from Defense Secretary Jim Mattis' office to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Commander-in-Chief will watch from a reviewing stand by the Capitol surrounded by veterans and Medal of Honor recipients. Trump ordered the celebration last month after he was enthralled by the pomp and circumstance of Bastille Day on a visit to France. But the idea was met with criticism from members of both parties who expressed dismay that such a show of force is more reminiscent of authoritarian regimes. White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney has also estimated the display could cost upward of $30 million.